Good afternoon. Welcome to another exciting day at the Global University, where nothing is out of balance. Actually, to state right off, these are called conversations with sessions, right? And these are informal. These are meant to be to bring in people we consider to be particularly interesting, particularly emblematic, they embody something, figures in the field, in other words, and to allow them to speak more or less freely about their career trajectories, about what it is to be occupying this field. And in this case, we have, I think, the foremost scholar in the history of science of Russia. No, I think this is true.
For better or worse.
Everything's relative, you know.
So you can all judge how easy the low-hanging fruit is to eat.
Yeah. But really, no. But I think this is true. So this is, I think, the most prominent, a productive scholar in the history of science of Russia, in particular, and the Soviet Union, who's at Princeton University, and he's been prolific in various regards. First of all, if you just take a look at the file here.
It's not everything. Unfortunately, I don't have everything, so I'm sorry, Michael.
There's a book on Hiroshima that's missing. Yeah. That has a paragraph about Russia. It's totally on Russia.
Well, so this is what you call in the field humiliation. Right? So while the rest of us are struggling to get paragraphs right, he's struggling to finish books. Right? And I don't even struggle. So if you look at this, how old are you? Don't answer that. He's extremely prolific, and he's also been very prominent also in training graduate students, at least two of whom are here. One of whom has finished, and the other one is on the way to finish. Right?
Yes. The advising session for Monday.
Yeah.
TBD.
So I emphasize here that this is the time to ask the sorts of questions you would not ask at a proper academic panel. The kinds of questions that you would not ask normally if we were to have a proper lecture or even a paper presentation. This is the time to actually ask, really how does the profession work, and the questions that you've always been needing to ask but were afraid to. I would start it off, and Michael thankfully did not prepare anything. And so I started off by simply asking Michael to tell us a little bit about how we got into things and how things have changed since we got into things, which is partly his own doing, and he's changing the subfield, but he's both a member of, we see both as a historian of science and a historian of Russia. Of particular concern to me, and here I think we overlap, is that the fact that we're dealing with fields that have been regarded as insular in many regards, particularly the Russian field. I can speak from experience, and you can speak about the history of science, and how we've been trying over time to break out of that insularity. Yesterday we had a very nice session, two very nice sessions, and one of the questions that came up is, if you were to take, for instance, study mathematics and internationalize it, how do you therefore explode the boundaries of the history of mathematics in Russia? And the answer is yes, but you're still in the history of mathematics. So then how do you contextualize it in terms of politics or politics of power? So maybe you just want to just pick up this thread and take it where you like.
You want the biographical disciplinary?
I'd like the biographical.
Okay. We'll start with the biographical. So I entered as a freshman at Harvard University. I was going to be a physicist. I was sure of that from basically 9th grade of high school. And then I took a physics class my first semester, and it was clear that the purpose of the physics class is to train you to be a physics major. The purpose of being a physics major is to train you to being a physicist. And you could reverse engineer what it meant to be a physicist from that first class, and I did not want to turn into that. So it happened that there was a history of science department, which is rare, and there was a history of physics course that I took at the same time. And in the next semester, there was a seminar on science in Russia and the Soviet Union, taught by Lord Graham, who's supposed to be sitting right here. And that's, there was, at that point, let's see, 5 people teaching at universities who did anything on history of Russian and Soviet science, and the leader of them was sitting in the front of the seminar, smaller than the people in this room. So,
some of the other people who were at that point?
So people who were at that point, there was David Jarafsky at Northwestern, who was nearing retirement. There was Alexander Vucinich at Stanford, Dan Totis at Hopkins, who's still there teaching, and Mark Adams at Penn. And I think that's...
Josephson is on the scene yet.
Josephson is, at that point, bouncing around between Sarah Lawrence and New Hampshire, and then, he was just finishing. And then this is right before that wave of people like Alexei Kuzhennikov and Nikolai Klementsov who come over, and Slava Garovich, who all come over in the early 90s. This is early 90s.
Did you ever interface with Owen Gingerich?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
excellent.
Yeah. He was also he was about to retire, but even since then he's been very engaged. It turns out that this book is about. Turns out has a Russian connection, but this is about a man named Emanuel Velikovsky who interacted with Harlow Shapley, who is Owen Gingrich's mentor, and so Owen Gingrich is responsible for the transport of the archive to Harvard from Shapley, and so we had lots of exchanges. He arranged an event. He's a character in the book. One of those cases where he's a primary source, a secondary source, and what I call a tertiary source, someone who read a chapter of it who corrected. I took this class, and I didn't think, of course, that history of Russian science was a thing you could do. I didn't know history of science was a thing you could do, and then I figured out you could do these things, and I realized quite quickly that I would have to learn Russian to do this, which fortunately was a lot of fun to do, which I had not expected it to be. And then over time, so that the biographical thing I sort of backed into it. I had a long-standing interest in Russian literature and Russian history, and a strong interest in science, and over time those kind of flipped.
Where did you do your Russian training?
At Harvard as well. Like took a series of intensive courses, and then I plopped myself in St. Petersburg and wandered around.
ACTR or?
Nope, just self-guided in a sense. I had the first trip to Russia. I hadn't decided. Lauren Graham and I had this long-standing discussion where he would find everybody who was interested in the history of Russian science and say, you should work on Dmitry Mendeleev. And everybody said, yeah, but I'd rather work on something so. And so this happened over and over and over again. And I'm the only one gullible enough to say, like, if I write a term paper about it, will you shut up? And this was the first year of grad school, and I wrote a term paper about it. That was the first active use of lots of the Russian material. And I was like, okay, I'll write another paper. And then I went in the summer, and I went into the archive, and that was sort of, the archive is completely unexploited. It's still unexploited. Mendeleev, starting about 1870, so after the periodic system, kept everything, all the letters, all the notebooks, his library, his marginalia, his terrible handwriting, but these big script crayons. And he had a cataract problem that got worse over life, so the handwriting gets worse but also bigger. And I went and started reading that stuff in the archive. And that's where it started. No, it's not. He has one of those wonderful Dom Musée things where there's this apartment. It's not the apartment he died in. So he lived in the 12 Colleges building, is where he lived. If you enter in, so you go, it's called Mendeleevskaya Linia, Mendeleev line, but it has a statue of Lomonosov on it. For post-Soviet reasons that I don't fully understand. It was supposed to be Mendeleev, but they had sculptures of done, but then the Academy insisted that it be Lomonosov because the bond is right at the end of that street, and Mendeleev was not elected to the Academy of Sciences, so it wouldn't have been appropriate. Even though so you go in and it's the shrine to him. There's like museum, and then his office is preserved, except it's totally reconstructed because he retired from the university in the early 1890s and moved to run the Metrology Bureau, the Weights and Measures Bureau, where he is throughout the 1890s, dies there in 1907, and then they reconstruct it back in 1911 at the university. So his statue is in front of the old Bureau of Weights and Measures, which is now the still Bureau of Weights and Measures, but it seems to be run by Philips, the electronics company. I don't understand the politics of it now. So this is so I went into the papers, and that was my so the archival and the conversational Russian came at sort of the same moment of just being inundated with it, and then over time I kept coming back using this archive, and the archive doesn't have everything. You need to go to GIA, which at that time was in the Senate. You had to go to the Navy, which is right across from Hermitage. Like, it's all in the same sector. And so the Mendeleev project grew out of me trying to appease Lauren Graham and get him off my back. And I was going to do something about chemical weapons in the Soviet Union, which no one still has done. There is no history of Soviet chemical weapons. I I don't think I'd be able to do it though, because.
But you are telling my Gordin and your students you should do the history of
But
chemistry.
I would, except I think the archives were more open in the 90s. This was the sort of the wonderful moment of the 90s. Wonderful and twisted in many ways, is the archives were all open. But there was no infrastructure to do anything, and some of the staff were still interested in holding back stuff. But it was before the funding for archives collapsed, so you could only request now 3 files a day. Back then, the Mendeleev archive was the only one there the entire time. And in the beginning, they tried to stall me, but then they realized that if they just gave me what I wanted, I would shut up for several days and read what they gave me. So we had a relationship. I would sit in the back in this freezing room built in the early 18th century and read files. So the Mendeleev thing started because Lord was really insistent on it. And his position was, we have a very good account of the construction of the periodic system, but we don't know any of the politics or the background history or any of this other stuff. So this would be similar to the case with Isaac Newton, where we thought we had a really good account of the origins of the Principia. And then people started looking at the theology and the alchemy and the politics and realized we don't. That we have to rethink the internal story we thought we knew because we didn't have everything else. And that turned out to be the case for Mendeleev as well. So that's how that sort of project began. And he's still a great subject. There's still tons to do. And not just about him, but he happens to be the only late imperial Russian scientist, with the exception, I would say, of Pavlov, who has a personal archive that's large and that everybody wrote to, who was socially central as well as intellectually central. So everybody wrote to him and he wrote back to everybody, and you have collections of material that's there. So you can actually, almost anybody bumped into him in some way, and you can find some tracks there, and it's an underexploited resource. So,
Question?
yeah.
What about the other fellow, Mikhail Lomonosov? His museum and house in Leningrad also.
Yeah, he does. So that he's a century early. But also he's tricky for other reasons. It's hard to talk about him because there's a narrative of him being the creator of Russian science, which
his name again?
Mikhail Lomonosov. He's sort of, in some ways he's the Russian Ben Franklin. He's the guy who works on electricity and chemistry, and that's what he's often talked about as.
And Russian language.
He's also the creator. He's also the first native-speaking creator of a Russian grammar. He's also the person who introduces or perfects iambic tetrameter as the meter for modern Russian poetry, and is the founder. So he's a sort of a Francis Bacon figure as well as a Ben Franklin figure, and he's an enormously interesting courtier involved with lots of imperial stuff. His collected works were published and are quite good in both the science and the poetry and the grammar, all of which is very, very interesting. But that's why he's at this beginning of the street, because he's the first native-born member of the Academy of Sciences. All the other earlier academicians are mostly Central Europeans, Swiss, and Southern Germans, including Euler.
He was one of the first in the Eastern, in the Russian part of Europe, to emphasize the importance of the Venus transits in the 1700s.
I don't think he's the. I mean, well, it depends. Is he?
That is, to get the Russians involved in, because Europe was already.
He's the first Slav to be interested in that.
Okay.
But there are all the members of the Academy of Sciences who are from Paris and Basel and so on in St. Petersburg are the ones who actually get the involvement. He serves as a very important touchstone figure for the construction of the Russian national mythos. He might have been in the opening ceremonies, but I've forgotten. He would be the kind of figure to be there. But he doesn't become as important. So he's important in the 18th century factually. He trains very few students, and his legacy sort of collapses. Unlike Euler, who trains a bunch of students who become very significant in the early 19th century. And then in around 1903, Boris Nikolaevich Menshutkin, who is the son of the secretary of the Russian Chemical Society, Menshutkin, the father, is probably writes a dissertation, which is a history of Lomonosov, which restarts the Lomonosov myth at exactly this moment when Russia's conceiving of itself as on a par with Germany, France, and Britain as a leading European superpower, or leading power in the sciences. And so Lomonosov gets retrofitted for this age of modernization. And then that perpetuates itself throughout the 20th century and into the 21st.
And that very same thing is picked up in the Soviet Union as well.
Yeah, no, he's this tendency to find the first person who did everything.
Yeah.
I mean, Lauren Graham's recent book argues that, and this is actually the part that I find amazing, that most of those stories are true. Like the first radio, the first light bulb, all those things are actually real. They're interesting that they got abandoned, but then they get found again.
Well, his argument is they never knew how to market them.
They never knew how to market them, but the fact that those aren't made up,
Yeah.
but are actually like real discoveries. The last time I was here, I talked about the first machine translation experiment on a large scale, which is at Georgetown in 1954. The first full-scale design of a machine translation machine is in the early 30s by a Russian telegraph engineer. There's no digital computer. This is relevant to everybody here. It's a telegraph system. It's a telegraph operator, which is going to use Esperanto as the interlanguage at the back to link up everything. And he gets a patent, whatever Soviet patents mean at that time, and a prize. And then it vanishes. And then once this Georgetown thing happens in 54, someone's like, 20 years ago, wasn't there that guy with the telegraph? And then he gets resurrected as the discoverer later. The Soviets end up having the largest machine translation infrastructure in the world, but that comes out of that. So Lomonosov was another thing I thought at some point I was going to work on, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. It's endlessly difficult to figure out how to do it because the mastery you have to have of Russian prosody is significant. And there's a very large shell of scholarship around him, which mostly puts him in the literature camp. And it's very good, a lot of that. The science stuff is jingoistic and not very good. This gets to some of the insularity.
Yeah.
So the insularity, I think, is actually, I hadn't thought about it until you put it this way, but the insularity of both fields strikes me as Cold War driven. So the history of science is older than the Cold War, but it's very small, and it becomes a much larger establishment in both the Soviet Union starting in the 30s, as part of a project to project a new image and bring Marxism into the heart of studying science. That's the idea in the early 30s. Then due to various stories that you can map out if you know your Soviet history, the Soviet history of science becomes incredibly internalist, as we would call it, entirely about the details of the science, because that way you don't muck with any of the social stuff, and you don't get into trouble with anybody. So that's where it moved in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 80s, it starts to open up, and it becomes heavily about Stalin and Lysenko. And that story, which you would expect in the 90s and so on. But the insularity on the Soviet sides was a Cold War product in some way. The insularity in the US was also that, because part of the institutionalization, especially at Harvard, which creates the second department in the country, the first is Wisconsin, which also has institutionalized Slavic studies, is designed...
The history of science.
His department of the history of science, a separate department, is created in part to, because President James Bryant Cohen, who had been a very important figure in science advising and policy, wants to train people to think critically, and the way you think critically, therefore non-Sovietly, is through science. So the history of science is a great way to teach people how to not be automata. So it gets institutionalized to be about teaching people how to think properly. And that, therefore, makes it necessarily internalist. It's about the theories themselves, situated at various points in time, and it excludes a lot of that social context, which will just muck everything up. Russian studies is severely, I don't want to say distorted, because that implies that there's an actual way it should have gone, but it's strongly shaped by the fact that there's so much money designed to study the Soviets specifically. That is, not the Soviet. Anything that's about the Soviets in a broader European context isn't about the porousness of that boundary, it's about how that boundary gets erected and fixed. So the insularity of both fields kind of grows together.
And if you put them together?
As you put them together, this is, so the earlier stuff, let's see, what's emblematic of so the stuff that's written in the 50s is all about the same thing. And it's mostly written by biologists and other scientists to say, Soviets can't really do science. See, what they do is suppress real science and put these party functionaries up and have them control everything. That's a narrative that one gets in the 50s, which is all about ideology corrupting science. And it's derived on the history of, on the Soviet side, it's derived from a Cold War era perspective. History of science side, it's derived from a particular positivism that had been imported from Vienna to University of Chicago in the US and blankets everything in a numbing way. In the 60s, you start to get slightly more attempts to integrate the party functionary, sort of more nuanced vision of the Soviet state, but with the same model. And then this is where Lauren Graham really, I think, enters. He published a series of pieces in the 60s in a book, but the big book, Science and Philosophy in the Soviet Union, comes out in '72. And the conceit of this is still like amazing to me that if you read Soviet physics articles, they always start with saying, Engels says this in Dialectics of Nature, here's my quantum electrodynamics. And then, or if the earlier period, Stalin says this in Anarchism or Socialism, which is the only piece that Stalin wrote that says anything about science, except for linguistics. And it says it like this, and then da-da-da-da-da, and then they just do the actual thing. And Lauren's question is puts on the, one of the things I like about the history of science is you can take on a pose of incredible naivete and be like, what if they meant it? So read the first paragraph not as window dressing, which it is sometimes. In fact, maybe most of the time, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes people actually read Engels and it does something for them. So trying to read seriously the constructiveness of the ideology. And that opened up a way of taking Soviet science seriously, not just as a world competitor, not just as a distorted version of proper Western science, but as a different kind of science being done in different ways. And there are places where it works, and there are places where it doesn't work. But it was opening up that possibility, which is exactly in line with revisionism as it hits Soviet studies. And not coincidentally, Sheila Fitzpatrick's at Columbia, exactly the time Lauren's at Columbia, and they're doing the same stuff in that area. And then Lauren is the only person who really trains students. Mark Adams trained one student, Dan Totis, trained 2 students total, one with the Soviets. And then Lauren Graham trained everybody else. So Kendall Bales, Doug Wiener, Paul Josephson, Carl Hall, and I'm last.
Who trained Kaziev?
Zhezhenko is Soviet.
Soviet.
Yeah, so the Soviet training is a separate sphere. There's a Moscow version and a Leningrad version, and they both do different kinds of stuff. But Jim Andrews is a student of Sheila Fitzpatrick's, right? But he's one of the few who came out of a Russian-Soviet history training and came into science. Most of the other people are from a science training who entered into this other area. Like, you were Rolodex in your head.
Except I keep forgetting their names.
But the 90s change a lot of things. There's a lot more access to material. There's a lot less money to go. Although IREX hasn't dried up entirely yet. But a function of the way visas used to work and funding used to work is that people used to do, if you're doing Russian or Soviet science, you're doing Russian or Soviet science. And the transnationality, which was part of that old bad positives generation, vanished in the 70s and 80s, where the goal was to figure out what's the history of American science, what's distinctively American about American science, what's distinctively German about German science, which was a nice move to try and get archival depth and locality. Unfortunately, in the Soviet case, it acquired this overly insular quality that fed into the way the field thought of
So
itself.
in your case, I mean, so the same way it was with me, for example, that if you wanted to go to research in the Soviet Union, you would have to do it through IREX and through Fulbright.
Right, yes.
Basically.
That was the way you had to go in, and you had to therefore package it as that.
As a Soviet project.
Right, and if you want to do something, like, so I have a student now who's doing the history of fisheries science. And it's involving, it started out as a history about the Caspian, but it's now about a series of fishery collapses and disasters that involves archives in Moscow, Astrakhan, Norway, Sweden, Peru, Japan. That kind of transnational project you couldn't do. Or like it would be very hard for you to get the money together and the skill set together to do that. And that kind of transnationality was the original idea behind the Belgian madman who institutionalized the history of science in the US, George Sarton, was to get the whole globe in the story. And that globe drops out because of an archival turn, and now that globe is popping back in. So the history of science in some ways was transnational before, and it took, except for Russian and Soviet science, which was always national. Because there were stakes in the field then. You're supposed to prove, there's stakes now, but the stakes are different. The stakes then were about proving that Americans are rational and that Soviets aren't rational and that they got lucky with spying. And so like there was this narrative that it's very easy to read it once you see it, and it was probably impossible to see it in the 60s because you were too close.
And so there is an underlying self-righteousness, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sanctimoniousness, proselytism also.
Yeah.
Has this? Do you find it still there?
It's there in some places.
I can see the long range work, for example.
Yeah, in Lawrence, I think it's growing up again, but it's still there in some places. In a sense, Lawrence work was much less proselytizing before than it is now. I can't speculate about psychologically or research-wise why he went that way, but there's some of that there. There's still some narrative that people, I think, are trying to build, but it's not. I guess the turn that happened in the 90s is instead of looking at the Lysenko effect, when people got very sick of it about 95, because there were just waves of archival material, memoirs, all very extremely interesting sources. But it's like the Stalinist crimes story, now the Yellen, everybody was done. And then everybody's attention tried to move everywhere else. So instead of focusing on the pathologies, let's focus on the healthy part. And now there's as these dialectics usually work, there's an attempt to try and integrate the weird parts of Soviet science with the parts that look normal. And that occasionally produces the sanctimoniousness and high-mindedness of the earlier stuff does creep back in. But it's
we had a fascinating conversation yesterday, and it was about all sorts of things, but because I'm not a historian of science, I zeroed in on certain things.
Yeah.
I mean, it was much more wide-ranging than what I'm about to send you. But so we had papers, and all of them were talking about science as an international community. Not transnational, but international.
Yeah.
Transnational might yet come in,
Yeah.
but so far it's international. It was fascinating because one of the points that everyone was driving home, and the research is just fascinating. I mean, all the research that we presented yesterday. And it's savvy research also, because by looking at networks and international networks in particular, they're coming to drive home the point empirically, which has to be the foundation of what we do. They're driving home the point that everyone was embedded in one or another national politics. And we were talking about Courant in particular. Brittany was, have you met Brittany?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm sure you have it. Yeah? And so she's actually gone and gotten her hands dirty in these archives. And she's saying, well, where did the funding come from? And this we're talking about, who was it finally? It was the naval, was it naval money that was coming?
Was it Office of Naval Research? Or was it?
Well, the Courant Institute itself is sponsored by a constellation of military and private foundations, mostly the Office of Naval Research. But the particular international conference where about 24 American mathematicians went to the Soviet Union for 2 weeks in 1963 was sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences.
Was it actually sponsored by them, or was it a cutout? So, like, for example, the funding for machine translation is the National Science Foundation on paper, but it's the CIA. Eventually the CIA takes it over. But it's actually the NAS. But there are lots of cases with these cutouts. So
this was under the umbrella of the Inter-Academy Exchange Agreement, which was under the larger umbrella of the Scientific and Cultural Exchange Agreement. That particular.
I mean, I was walking through it yesterday. I was saying, look, I'm not a historian of science, but if I were to trace who paid for my education, my graduate education, basically it's the entire military-industrial complex,
yeah.
right? I mean, including the CIA. I mean, front organizations,
yeah.
things like that. So, but I'm sort of relaxed about this. They haven't told me what to think. So we do have a lot of autonomy, unless it's all subconscious.
But this is actually, there was a narrative in the 80s when this starts to happen with the history of American Cold War science. There's this foundational article with no one is ever going to pick it up who's not in the history of science, because it's called Behind Quantum Electronics. And no one's going to read this piece. But it's a 90-page article documenting the money, which is a very strong false consciousness narrative that basically physicists used to do real science, and then they became all applied scientists, basically engineers with fancy labels, doing all this corrupt stuff for the military-industrial complex. It's clearly an expression of rage. It's the Strategic Defense Initiative and the Reagan years. But that started people asking about the money. And the argument then became, does the money actually shape you or not? And how can we test that? And that's something which, I also got, basically, IREX money is sort of foreign policy money. You had to sign that agreement that you weren't allowed to, that you weren't going to spy. I remember that was part of it. It was like, I promised not to talk to any intelligence services when I return about anything else.
Yeah.
I don't know why that agreement's there. It's not like it would stop you if you were actually going to be a spy.
I think the original reason was because it was the fear that as an IREX scholar, you would spy for the United States in Sardinia.
Right. Right, but why would a signing of this paper stop? Everybody's going to sign that regardless of whether they're a spy.
Because we're honest.
Oh, come on.
I was just joking.
Yes.
So seriously, so anyway, so the conversation went on, and we're saying, okay, if you establish this empirical background, so you're saying, okay, so if you have mathematicians who are funded by directly or indirectly the U.S. government here, maybe the defense industry, maybe not, the defense department or not, the CIA or not, but it's still government funded, right, to a large extent. And then you have comparable Russian scientists who are funded by the Soviet state. And a lot of them are working directly for, again, they walked us through it. You know, there was this military organization, explosives.
Spent time in this closed city or that closed city, yeah.
And so, if we leave it at that, then you have a certain comparability. So no one's, if the purity of your science is what's at stake, then nobody's pure, right? If that's what's at stake. Now, this does something to the narrative of Soviet science in particular, which is, you know, it's part of the intelligentsia narrative also. Which is to say that, and we were talking about this yesterday, that you have people who believe in pure thoughts and pure ideas. They're interested only in learning and knowledge, and advancing, pushing back the boundaries of ignorance, and introducing more light where there's darkness. One or another political power comes along and slaps them around. They're under the weight of this oppressive regime. They do things that they wouldn't have wanted to do. They're denouncing other people. They're working for to develop better explosives and things like that. And again, going back to the point that you were making, the idea is that they're doing this unwillingly, because inside them was a certain kernel of purity that was struggling to survive, right? And this is part of the larger intelligentsia narrative. It's not just about scientists. Now, as we went through the layers of intelligentsia, I mean, look particularly at the work of Benny Sklois, in terms of, you know, that particular part of the intelligentsia, and the point he made was that, you know, they actually weren't struggling to get away from the state, they were struggling to get into the state, right? And if you begin to use this optic and this lens and begin to think about the Russian scientific community in Soviet times, and this was a point that was it you, Adam, who was talking about, someone said Kotkonium, was that you?
That was that.
That was what?
Yeah.
Yago, right. Whatever, what they meant was, in other words, that a person isn't the object of power, necessarily. The person is implicated in power, and a person reproduces power. And a person who is working for, you know, Biographical or working in explosives isn't necessarily doing it because because they're forced to do it. I mean, they're part of something.
I mean, there used to be this model that if you sort of dropped out of your PhD program at MIT and did a startup in Silicon Valley, that you were selling out. Like that people do one thing. They either pursue money or they pursue knowledge. But like, I could do a startup because it's a better way to do the computer programming I want to do, and I'll make more money, and all my friends are doing it, and it's nice in the Bay Area. And like, you can hold multiple narratives in your head at any one time, and most people do. And I don't know why historiographically we refuse to see that.
And all of them are true, you figure.
All of them can be true, and sometimes you could be confused or have false beliefs about one or the other, but there's no reason why you can't even hold contradictory motivations at various points in time. And we don't have a narrative. So here are, I'm going to tell a sketch of a life story. A person from a reasonably modest background gets educated in the early Soviet state, sees some opportunities for advancement, reaches very high pinnacles in very politically sensitive areas of the Soviet state, ends up having a row with the leadership, gets internally punished, and dies. That narrative is Sakharov, that narrative is also Lysenko. It's the same career trajectory. We don't have a way of talking about the two in the same breath, because one of them is a villain narrative and one of them is a hero narrative. And we should be able, it's the same structural story, but we want to say that the motivations are corrupt or pure in exactly opposite senses in both cases, and that's difficult to do. And Sakharov in particular is very hard to do this for, partly because we don't know some of the crucial periods, because that's still classified, but also the level of significance of that one individual is so large, so important, that it's very hard to historicize certain periods because lots of people still have mistakes.
Oh, actually, I did that. I made a mistake. You know, I was in Paris talking to international historians in the end of January, and because I'm talking about this very prominent mathematician Marchuk, who is this unknown figure, like the monster of power of the Red Sea period, and he's actually one who talks to Sakharov when Sakharov gets out of, you know, and they have very similar trajectories.
Yeah.
Exactly, it's
The
like
same
the
thing,
story.
yeah.
And they mentioned Sakharov. Such a mistake.
Yeah.
Because like people just want to talk about Sakharov and how wonderful he was. It's like everybody forgot about my important guy. And I was like, okay, good lessons on next time. It's just because like when people in order to actors. So it's like
Partially this is a time thing. There was about 15, 20 years when people couldn't really talk about Oppenheimer in any sensible way. And then there used to be the famous black hole where people would go and start working on an Oppenheimer biography and you would never hear from them again. Like they would start and they would get into these. The problem with him is Oppenheimer says everything and its opposite. So you have to make a decision about when you believe him and when you think he's lying. And you have to have some frame to put that together, or you can choose to believe that he believed everything. And so people got stuck in this, and then the anniversary happened in 2004, his 100th anniversary, and then by like 5 biographies like hit the stands at once, because it finally had cracked the long delay. And Sakharov, it's going to be a longer delay. It's too.
but it's kind of toxifies even things around him because I mean there's so much information still available that which you can use to understand what people around, right? And then you can not because whenever people see the name, it's like we're a thing,
Yeah.
and then nobody sees anything
Well,
else.
Sakharov has a Rorschach quality about how you feel about the post-Soviet state now. Like whatever you think about Sakharov says something about how it could have been different than it is now, or it would have been worse had Sakharov had his way. Yeah, so it depends who you talk to. Everybody has views about that. So because of the Congress of People's Deputies and his political stance, right before he dies, he crystallizes stuff. Sakharov is one of these great figures that we need a good study of. We have good studies of parts of him, but we don't have an integrated whole. And I think part of it's that we don't put Lysenko in the same conversation.
In my correct maybe it needs to be graduated. Didn't the Sakharov pop into the general Western public knowledge when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and
Oh no, it's before that.
Before that.
It's before that because he writes an op-ed that ends up getting published in the New York Times about the need to stop nuclear testing and disarm. That had been something he'd been gradually moving towards for a while. That's 67 or 8. He gets slammed with everything that gets slammed in 68. And then he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 74? But 70s. He wins it in the 70s, before Afghanistan. And then he gets internally exiled, but Afghanistan brings visibility to him.
Okay.
But the Peace Prize, I'm pretty sure, is in the 70s. It's after the first internal exile. And that happens around the same time that there's dissidents being sent to mental asylums. And it's a very Brezhnevian story of that moment. But so he gets visible multiple different times, and in part because the emigre community in the U.S. is able to make him visible after Jackson Vanik emigration. So that's another thing that I think needs to be historicized for both. There's very little historiography of what I would call contemporary science, science since 1970. There's getting to be some, but there's reasons why there isn't. I mean, there aren't archives, history's further back. The science is much harder, which is not trivial. And there's way more of it. So
less
science,
theoretical also?
What?
Less theoretical also?
No, some of it's less theoretical. Both the theory and the empirical stuff just balloons. So there's, I can't call it, I'm going to use a word and Brian is going to get upset. There's an exponential increase of science. It's a logistic increase. There is a very big bigness that gets bigger across this period. The more science has been done since 1970 to the present than has been done in the history of the world combined. You add everything up before 1970, we've had more since. And we have very little historiography of it. And what that adds in is the importance of the computer to all science now. It adds in publishing, and it adds in stuff like Jackson, Vanek, and Refuseniks, and international labor markets. All of that stuff is not integrated because the labor market was more nation-state bound earlier than later. And if we want to have a historiography that's open and transnational, that stuff needs to be made very central. And you've seen this creep that's happening in the historiography, right? Like, everybody used to be about the revolution, and everybody was about Stalin, and now everybody's about Khrushchev, and people are kind of looking at Brezhnev. There's sort of, and once we get there, like 8 years, I think, based on the creep that's happening now, there'll be a lot more possibilities for actually building that kind of story. But the historians of science can do some part of it, but the various national and international histories need to also do their part, so there's benefit from historiography. In the same way, I don't think it would be possible to write surveys of the history of the Soviet Union or histories that are synthetic in some way without recognizing the fact that the Soviet Union is essentially a scientific and technological experiment as well as a political one. The dams, the space program, the bomb, electrification, all that stuff it's a footnote now, right? Like now it's about ideology and politics and structures and the party state, and all of which is crucial.
Yes.
But that stuff happens, it's part of the same story, and both sides would benefit from that integration.
So this is the worst kind of question maybe because it makes it all about me, but do you have any intuition as to why there's been no history of economics in the Soviet Union?
Ooh.
None?
So my first guess is that people thought it wasn't real. So there's two.
Okay, but that doesn't stop them running out of center.
Oh, but that illuminated something. That illuminated a pathology and proved something about our science being better than their science. Whereas the postulate of Cold War historiography is that Soviet economics is nonsense. So like I feel like that's sort of built into the field, but also I think people don't trust the data.
You're talking about post-war anyway.
Yeah.
I'm talking about post-1930.
Oh.
There's plenty of stuff about the 1920s, and there's nothing after that.
I think it's also the numbers have become very difficult to interpret.
No, not the economic history.
Oh,
But the
the
economic
theory of it's also a generalized section. The way the history of science field evolved as a whole, maybe this is just universal. It started with physical sciences and mathematics. That was the first thing, and then people were like, there were life sciences too, geology. We should talk about those. And then the social sciences, like then you get psychology, and then you get the social sciences. And the history of social sciences is only flourishing now for both places, like for both places all over the world. That's become a much more rich area. And so, considering that there's actively about 40 to 50 people who work on the history of Russian and Soviet science period, and that includes people who work very part-time or have other sort of sets of interests, the social sciences is going to take time. I think that's why. That the bigger questions were traditional science and social science less so. There's only now starting to be sort of detailed histories of linguistics, detailed histories of post-Pavlovian psychology, pedagogy, all these other fields need stuff. And so you should finish as quickly as possible. And that way there will be more. But I think that's just a general, it's basically the Comtean hierarchy reinscribed, right? The histories start with astronomy and then they kind of percolate down to eventually getting to sociology. And sociology is banned too, right? There isn't a field of sociology in the Soviet Union until about the mid-50s.
Yeah, it only really takes off after that.
Yeah.
But that has to do with the notion that the society is basically made up of classes, not individuals,
Right.
and sort of the individualized psychology of their kind wouldn't work, obviously, for obvious reasons.
Right.
Because it can deal with the collective as well. But when it comes to economics, and here I'm not sure we're even onto something. Where is there any history of Russian economic thought for any period? And we have these compendia by Barnett and
Barnett's the
Steinmetz,
person I'm
right?
thinking of, yeah.
those two people, they've been coming out with things, but these are really just really vague overviews. I mean, they're not
So
really
there's
research.
a series of, several good works from the economics.
Yes. Right in the 1920s, but take us to the imperial period, war communism, take us into the, and then beyond the 20s. There isn't very much at all. I mean, so Anne is writing something which is partly political economy and history of economic thought.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're reading all of them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, you know?
Yeah, there's nothing, I mean, as far as secondary sources, I haven't found very much at this point.
I mean, the Gershenkoron sort of sits like
Yeah.
like this thing over the center of the 19th century. There's a particular, I mean, I do some of it in the Mendeleev book, because Mendeleev has lots of economic thoughts, but there was very little historiography to work on. So maybe it's just that not to explain why it has stopped in the 30s. The thing to explain is why does it exist for the 20s, which would in itself be an interesting question. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the 1960s and 70s, there's a series of books written by economists trying to assess the usage of mathematical economics. But they completely take it for granted that they know what it ought to be. Right? They just look at where they recognize the formalisms in the models, and then tell a completely eternal story of the development of those formalisms and models, completely again ignoring the epigraph of Lenin or Engels and whatnot before it. Completely ignoring all the cybernetics discourse which is surrounding it. And not telling any of the institutional stories whatsoever. And just saying, okay, well, it was suppressed because he was Stalin, and now Stalin's dead, so now economics is rejoining the world mainstream in the Soviet Union, and maybe that'll be great. And then it doesn't turn out so great, and they lose interest. And there's only that 4 books, all written by economists.
That strikes me as fitting this particular pattern. I mean, like there's such a small end with people who are working on, you know, the largest scientific community in the world. There's a very small group of people working on it, and that small set of people are attracted to shiny things like bombs and spaceships, and that's where the attention went. And so as a result, there hasn't been the development from the history community that way. So you'd expect it to be internal stuff coming from the practitioners. It's also the case that economics is so anglophone that as a field, that there are very few people in the history of economic thought profession who can read the language.
Yeah, just a general question that kind of relates to that point. You listed all the names of people who were working in Russian Soviet science, and you said that they were, almost everybody was a history of science person who then focused on Russia. Is that typical for history of science generally, and how much does it matter? You know, how different would you imagine the field to be if it had been a bunch of Russianists who then became interested in science?
So Lauren, actually it's an interesting question that's changing now. It used to be that everybody who was a historian of science came from science training. They had an undergraduate or graduate degree in science, and they got interested in history later. Over the last 15 years, in applicants to grad school, you see this too. That happens less often. Often because you find people who are really good historical minds who have taken some scientific training and who are interested in asking certain kinds of epistemological questions, but from a historian's point of view. And that's a shift that's quite marked in the field. You can definitely see that transition. I think what the risk is with that transition is that people, it's so much, for me also much more fun to not do the, this equation to this equation. Like but you need to do that. And if you don't come from a background which whether you can do it, whether you have to believe that you need to learn how to do it, just like you need to learn. You have this problem you want to do, it requires you to learn Bulgarian, so you learn Bulgarian. That kind of attitude towards the internal material is important, and that might not have happened had it gone the other way. But the reason, so the shift has been among the applicant pool, but there's also been a structural shift in the universities where the allies of the historians of science were the science departments. They were the ones who wanted to have this thing around. In the early 90s, that fractures entirely. This is the Sokol hoax, which yes, it was. Well, it's because of NYU faculty member who is. So the vision that the thing that's hurting the position of physics in the world today is not the end of the Cold War; it's postmodernism, and because of postmodernism, all the science study stuff is bunk. It created this fracture where the historians of science are viewed with suspicion by the scientists. And that realignment of interest in the university is quite strong. So most research departments of history have some recognition that history of medicine, or history of science, or history of technology is something that is part of the narrative of history. That used to not always be true.
Do you accept this debate? I mean, Sokol's argument that we stop dealing with reality at some point.
No. And given that Sokol's an old-line Marxist, I don't think he believes it either.
I thought you believed that Kaiser was an old line.
It was, it doesn't seem to me to capture what's going on. There are...
You all know about Sokol, right?
In 1994, he published an article called Towards Hermeneutics of Post-Quantum Gravity. Towards Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which is a pastiche, a funny pastiche, of quotations from history of science, mostly sociology and philosophy of science articles, actually, not history ones, that was published. It wasn't published under peer review, actually. It was published by Social Text, which is not peer review.
Steve wrote to the editorial committee.
Yes.
Yeah, generously cited the chair of the editorial committee.
Right. So it was a mistake.
It was a joke. It was a
joke. And then in lingua franca of using Biographical no longer exists, which is a kind of gossip rag for academia, he came out at the same time that it came out and said it was a hoax. And this got lots of finger wagging by scientists saying, "Oh my God, you historians of science are such idiots." Us historians of science saying, "This is absurd. This doesn't demonstrate anything one way or the other." And it became part of this cultural politics that had more to do with the collapse of physics funding from the federal government than anything else. So it was amenable to a social explanation, just like everything else. So have we lost touch with reality? No. I don't think. No. But it seems like the what's at issue there is who has the authority to talk about science, and it seems to me the proper question. The reason why I think the parting of ways is probably a good thing is because the real question is who has the authority to talk about the past, and it's not obvious that scientists know the history. In fact, it's obvious that most scientists don't know the history of their field very well at all. And in some cases, principally physics are actively hostile to knowing the history of their science. Chemists and physicians... What?
Because this part of this confession happened yesterday, it was precisely what Miles said, that some physics people are like...
Yeah,
this is exactly the phrase that
Yeah.
Why is that?
I actually don't know. Chemists really act differently about this.
Yeah.
And I think in part because they're still using stuff from the 19th century. They still do the reactions that they have to learn. They have to go back to find the original sources. The physicists, there's a novelty associated with it, but I don't really know why, but it's noticeable that that community is much more resistant. Biologists still read Darwin. They're not very interested in the history after Darwin up until about 1970, but they do have this knowledge of the mid-19th century that's actually fairly deep for evolutionary people.
We strongly judge it up. We have to keep history.
Yeah, there's keeping the historical records, and then there's the question of understanding the narratives.
Which go back thousands of years.
Yeah, the concepts go back, but whether people really know what Herschel did.
Yeah,
And-
well, many do not. I mean, after a while of being in the field, you realize that you're doing stuff which is based on a slow evolution of what was done,
Which-
say by the Babylonians.
Right, but that's true for many physicists as well, but yet not recognized by them. So it's a culture of the individual subfields that has this particular attitude. I don't quite know why it is, but it is noticeable in some cases. And when you actually sit down and talk to the scientists about what a historian does and what the archives tell you and what you can reconstruct from these things, there's an appreciation that this is actually getting at some stuff. It's the superficial, if you're not telling advertising jingles about how awesome the science is, you're somehow not doing the job properly. Anything you say that's critical gets seen as muckraking, which is not.
Even
what
something
it-
introspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anything that's, any story you tell that's, until very recently, the story you told that didn't have Lysenko be a big villain, but instead tried to illuminate something else in the process, or say in Kremetsov's case, said that the geneticists were perfectly eager to have Stalin step in and ban on that side, that was received poorly, and received poorly by a community that wants the white hats and the black hats to be that way, even though they know from departmental politics that white hats and black hats are hard to find.
Can I ask a question that goes back to when you were saying earlier that some of Lauren's thoughts worked for some fields and not for others? And one of the questions I had, or continue to have, is we're used to the purity talk and the kind of political purity talk, but I wonder if you think about the content of the scientific thought itself, to what extent, say, other analytic frames like disciplinary divisions that might occur differently in various periods might have an effect as well, and whether you're thinking of it worked in some fields and not in others maps onto disciplinary frames much more than it does on the changing politics, say, at the state level. Does that make sense? To think of other ways of dividing up knowledge that might not have the kind of standard purity narrative into politics.
Yeah, no, Lauren's approach was designed for the purity narrative. That was what it was for, and therefore it worked best with fields that were largely theoretical, like gravitational physics or child psychology and cognition, language development. So Vygotsky and Falk are the best examples. And works much less well for much more social level questions like field dynamics, which is, if you do that, you end up more where Slava is, with changing constellations of disciplinary arrangements and how those shape the way patronage works, but also shape the way certain kinds of questions are askable and answerable. So I think if we moved away from purity talk, we'd also move away from certain questions get lost as well as get gained. So I think we gained something, but I think the power of the Graham argument when it worked best, and when it still works best, is that it just forces you to recognize that people who start from positions that you might think are philosophically incoherent or bankrupt can produce interesting knowledge that lasts. And then you have a philosophical question, which is probably a red herring as well, about why knowledge produced in a weird way is still knowledge. But that's the kind of area of debate that the 70s was very big in. There were lots of epistemic speak in there, and the way you're talking now, which is the way I personally try to agree with, is much more of a thoroughgoing social and cultural historical approach, as opposed to one that's centered around the questions of epistemology. I hope that gets somewhere.
You mentioned before, and about, okay, I don't quite remember exactly what you said, but there was a period in the 20s where there was a transition from, say, pre-revolutionary era to now you're in Stalin's era, and then there was a gap in the 30s, I guess with lack of news and entertainment, so there's a vacuum there. One thing would puzzle me, and then as a result of the new movie Gravity that came out, and everyone was talking about the fabulous special effects and all this and all that. But there was a movie made, and I've only seen clips once in a while, in the Soviet Union, in or about 1920, on space travel. It was an imaginary journey by means of a rocket.
Aelita, Queen of Mars?
Sorry?
I think it's Aelita, Queen of Mars. Is that
I
one?
think what is this?
No, it wasn't.
No, because that has a space journey in it. That's
Yeah,
right.
okay, that's, it was the fancy crazy lady.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's.
Not that one. Okay.
Oh, that's, no, it was in that period, but it was something Voyage, Incredible Voyage, whatever. And it was science fiction. But I was just curious in what context would that have been done? Because also rockets were still essentially on a pick product.
Oh no, so
and the idea of how they would conceive of and then have the motivation to mimic in ancient cinematography what was supposed to be the effects of
okay, so where this comes from, and this is actually someone else who came from a history of science background and backed into Russian history, Asif Siddiqui, has a nice account of, I think, where this would come from. There's hobbyist rocketry culture that's very, very active around 1900 in three places.
in Eastern Europe.
No, the three places are Germany, the US, and Russia, which are the three places that develop rocketry programs. So there's active discussion in the popular press, and Andrews' book talks about this as well, from before the revolution through the early 20s and into the 30s, of what space travel would be like, how rockets might work, what would happen in zero gravity. That's an active conversation among engineering hobbyists. So that's where the ideas would most certainly have come from. And that's, so rockets aren't just paper then. There's lots of like attempts to try and figure out how to get something to work. But it's a club level thing that then percolates up to state interest. But you have interesting effects that the US part of the reason why the Germans are so easy to integrate after World War II into both camps is because there's a pre-existing culture of enormous expertise and interest in precisely this question. I know that gets away from the film thing, but it says that there is a cultural interest in this thing that predates the technical capacities for getting even close to an actual voyage.
But
He's
there
right
is
up here
still
in
an
the order.
interesting,
He's actually just up
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
and there is also an interesting story of the special effects in the Soviet cinema, and I forgot the name, but there is like, I'm talking literature coming out for it will be out there very soon, but you know, like there's very interesting technical developments of how we present these things. So there is a correspondence to like the real technical developments and the technical developments we need to be able to picture that
Right,
and project them.
and that's something else that the history of Russian and Soviet science has not been very good at, which the history of what American science and British science is much better at,
Well, the other thing
is
is
the
film
popular
and-
culture film integration into the storyline, which we do less. And which is weird because there's an enormous ferment in Soviet film.
You mean